You're about to hear a gripping story that unveils the hidden truths behind the walls of justice. A tale of courage, corruption, and the relentless pursuit of fairness. This story shines a light on the quiet bravery of individuals who refuse to let the system go unchecked, no matter the consequences. It's a reminder that the fight for integrity often starts in the most unexpected places. The marble floors of the Savannah Federal Courthouse echoed like a warning bell as spectators filed into courtroom 12A, their footsteps muted by the tension already tightening the air. Cameras weren't permitted inside, but that didn't stop reporters from crowding the hallway, pressing their ears to the heavy doors and texting updates before anything had even begun. At the defense table stood Tom Homan, former acting director of ICE, clad in a weathered navy suit that seemed more battle armor than courtroom attire. His tie was slightly loose, jaw clenched, eyes locked on the elevated bench before him. Across from him, presiding with a cold, impenetrable calm, sat Judge James Boasberg, a man whose name had become a lightning rod in the national immigration debate. Everyone expected a showdown, but no one could have predicted how fast the temperature in the room would rise. The issue at hand. Homan had allegedly defied a court-issued freeze on deportations under the reactivated Alien Enemies Act. Flights had left Miami and Phoenix anyway. Dozens of Venezuelans, many seeking asylum, were already gone. Boasberg leaned forward, hands folded, voice low but slicing. "This court issued a clear temporary restraining order, Mr. Homan. You ignored it." Homan didn't blink. "We responded to a national security threat, Your Honor. We acted under the authority of a 200-year-old statute that Congress has never repealed. You may not like that, but that doesn't make it illegal." The gallery shifted. Attorneys straightened in their chairs. Boasberg's brow twitched, but his voice remained smooth. "You're accusing this court of bias?" Homan stepped forward slightly. "I'm saying the law should stand on its own, without influence from advocacy groups feeding arguments into chambers behind closed doors." Gasps. Audible this time. A few pens stopped scribbling. The gallery went still. The needle had just been driven deep. And Boasberg knew it wasn't rhetorical. "You are here under subpoena, Mr. Homan," the judge said, his voice rising. "You do not lecture this court, and you certainly do not question my integrity." Homan's eyes burned with something colder than rage. "Then, don't make this personal, Judge." The room snapped into silence. It wasn't a retort, it was a warning. Boasberg sat back, lips tightening. "You want to defend actions that violate my direct order? Fine, but don't pretend you have credibility left. Your track record speaks for itself." And then, in a moment that would later be dissected on news channels across the country, Boasberg added something off script. Low, but caught by court recorders and reporters alike. "You've always been good at playing the patriot, Tom. Too bad no one with real power ever took you seriously." The line didn't carry the force of a gavel, but it landed like a bomb. Not a legal statement, but a personal attack, designed to wound. Homan didn't react, not with his face, but the stillness in his body said everything. Something had just shifted, and while the court hadn't felt it yet, the storm had already started. Tom Homan didn't flinch at the judge's final jab. He didn't raise his voice, didn't pound the table, didn't even look toward the murmuring crowd behind him. Instead, he slowly reached down to the side of his briefcase, unclasped a hidden compartment, and withdrew a sealed manila envelope marked with a crimson sticker. "Internal Confidential, DOJ Ethics Division." The seal was unbroken, but its mere presence shifted the courtroom's energy. The gallery leaned forward as if pulled by gravity. Even Judge Boasberg's eyes flickered, not with curiosity, but with calculation. Homan held the envelope in one hand like a detonator. "I was hoping we wouldn't need this," he said calmly, his voice suddenly too loud in the silence. "But I won't be insulted by someone who should have recused himself months ago." That line hit like a shot. A court officer straightened in his seat. A journalist in the second row whispered to her colleague, already halfway through composing a headline. Judge Boasberg leaned forward again, but the confidence from moments earlier had dimmed just slightly. "What is that?" he asked. "A sworn affidavit," Homan replied. "Not from me, from someone who worked in your chambers for 5 years. His gaze didn't waver. It's addressed to the Office of the Inspector General, and it details communication, informal, undocumented, and unlawful, between this bench and an outside legal group with a stake in this very case. A single gasp broke the tension. Boasberg's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, the court clerk stood up abruptly and cleared his throat. "The court will take a brief recess," he announced. Boasberg didn't argue. He didn't object or offer justification. He simply nodded once, curt, cold, and stood. But as he turned to leave through the judge's private exit, a flicker of something new crossed his face. Not anger, fear. Behind him, the envelope remained untouched on the defense table, like a live wire. Outside, word was already spreading through courthouse corridors. Reporters dashed for the hallway, phones to ears, thumbs tapping screens. The confrontation had started as a legal showdown. In less than 5 minutes, it had transformed into something far more volatile. The rulebook wasn't just being challenged, it had just been set on fire. The hallway outside courtroom 12A buzzed like a disturbed hive, packed wall to wall with reporters, court officers, and congressional aides trying to make sense of what had just unfolded. Phones were pressed to ears, camera crews rushed to set up just beyond the courthouse steps, and the phrase judicial misconduct was already being whispered like gospel. But Tom Homan stood still, unshaken, beside his attorney Elise Tran, who had just joined him from the side corridor. She was precise and calm, her expression unreadable as always, but her voice was a low blade as she leaned in close. "It's happening," she whispered. "The fuse is lit." Homan nodded once, never taking his eyes off the judge's exit door. Elise continued, "That affidavit, it didn't come out of nowhere. Nolan Greer." "Ring a bell?" Homan's jaw flexed. "Boasberg's intern?" Elise gave a curt nod. "Quiet, watched everything for 5 years, then disappeared. No one asked why." Homan exhaled slowly. He remembered the kid. Pale, polite, always in the background. The kind you don't notice until you realize he saw everything. Elise pulled out her phone and showed him a file name. "This is what he sent the DOJ. Metadata logs, calendar entries, draft revisions, and something else." She paused. "There's a lunch meeting on record. Boasberg and Howard Ashcroft, the lobbyist tied to the Southern Justice Collective." Greer heard it. Heard the judge ask for specific language in an amicus draft before the group even filed it. Homan's gaze didn't move, but his voice dropped to a whisper. "That's not bias. That's coordination." Elise nodded. "Exactly. And if that envelope holds what I think it does, Boasberg won't be the only one sweating by tomorrow." In the distance, a marshal cracked open the courtroom door. The recess was nearly over, but whatever had just cracked open inside that courtroom wasn't going to close again. Not today. Not quietly. As Homan and Elise straightened their jackets and stepped forward, it was no longer just about defending an action. It was about pulling back the curtain on an entire system that had grown far too comfortable in the shadows. Miles away from the chaos unfolding in Savannah, tucked inside a small rented cabin outside Asheville, North Carolina, Nolan Greer sat alone, staring at the flickering blue light of a muted television. His name hadn't hit the news yet, but it was only a matter of time. On screen, court sketches of Tom Homan and Judge Boasberg filled the frame, with anchors speculating about the mysterious document Homan had dropped like a grenade. Nolan knew exactly what it was, because he had written it. 2 months earlier he had quietly resigned from his clerkship in Boasberg's chambers. No farewell party, no exit interview, just a hard drive packed with metadata, a sealed affidavit, and one burning truth. The justice system wasn't blind. It was wired, connected, and manipulated. He hadn't planned to be a whistleblower. He had only planned to survive a job that had slowly, quietly broken his trust. The first red flag had come wrapped in a benign calendar entry, community alignment brief, draft consult. Innocent enough, until he noticed the attached document didn't match anything that had been filed with the court. It wasn't from a law firm. It was from Southern Justice Collective, a nonprofit Boasberg often cited in ruling. Then came the whispers behind doors. Names like Nadia Bellamy and Howard Ashcroft, not just advocates, but strategists. Boasberg had claimed they were offering context, but Nolan heard more than context. He heard favors. He remembered that lunch like it was scorched into his memory. He had stepped out to grab a printout, paused outside the door, and heard it clear as day. "Give me language that'll hold up," Boasberg had told Ashcroft, "and I'll give it weight." That moment broke something in him. Over the next few weeks, Nolan began collecting everything. TMLEs on early briefs, records of edits made inside chambers before official filings, even IP logs linking document access to Bellamy's policy team. It wasn't just unprofessional, it was judicial choreography. Nolan compiled it all into a sworn affidavit and mailed it to the DOJ with the label "For Urgent Review" scrawled across the top in red ink. Then he vanished. No press, no leaks, just silence. He didn't do it for fame. He didn't even do it for revenge. He did it because he couldn't keep pretending that justice was still sacred when it was being rewritten in advance. Now, watching the court coverage in real time, Nolan didn't feel vindicated. He felt exposed. Because the storm had begun, and the truth he'd released wasn't his to control anymore. It belonged to the country now. When the courtroom doors reopened that afternoon, the mood had shifted. The buzz of earlier had quieted into something sharper. Tension distilled into silence. Judge James Boasberg did not return to the bench. In his place sat Judge Clara Miles, a seasoned federal magistrate known for her composure and refusal to perform for headlines. She offered no commentary, no preamble. Just a single nod to begin. Elise Trance stood immediately, voice crisp, eyes unwavering. "Your Honor, in light of the sealed affidavit entered this morning, I respectfully request that it be read into the official record, in full, for transparency." A brief pause followed. Judge Miles turned to the court-martial. "Proceed." The marshal opened the envelope, pulled out the pages, and began reading aloud. What followed wasn't dramatic, it was surgical. Precise language, dates, times, file names, digital footprints. Every sentence crafted not to accuse, but to document, layer by layer, a timeline of quiet misconduct. The affidavit laid out how Judge Boasberg's clerk had received pre-daily drafts of legal briefs from Southern Justice Collective, often weeks before they were publicly submitted. It cited how metadata showed edits made inside Boasberg's chambers long before the advocacy group's attorneys had officially presented their arguments. It included screenshots of internal memos, calendar invites labeled innocuously as community outreach, and tracked IP logins that linked directly back to known political operatives. The courtroom didn't move. Not a shuffle, not a breath. Even reporters paused their frantic note-taking. The weight of it wasn't in the drama, it was in the evidence, laid bare with clinical clarity. As the marshal reached the final page, there was no applause, no eruption, just a heavy, collective reckoning. Tom Homan sat motionless, elbows on the desk, fingers tapping a slow, even rhythm. Elise didn't look away from the bench. And Judge Miles? She didn't flinch. When the reading ended, she simply closed her folder, leaned slightly forward, and said what everyone was thinking. The record is now complete. That was all. But it wasn't just a procedural step. It was the line being drawn. What had once been whispered as suspicion was now etched into the official record as fact. And the courtroom, once just another stage for legal argument, had become the front line of a systemic breach that was only beginning to unravel. While courtroom whispers echoed across headlines, the real fire was catching inside the DOJ Ethics Division headquarters in Atlanta, where a war room had been quietly assembled overnight. At its center sat Mariah Ellison, the department's lead investigator for judicial integrity in the Southeast. A former investigative journalist turned federal enforcer, Ellison didn't do theater, she did outcomes. By noon, she had reviewed the affidavit twice, cross-checked its metadata logs, and issued a sealed summons for Judge James Boasberg to appear in a closed-door session under oath. The room where it happened wasn't a courtroom. It was colder, clinical, and deliberately stripped of ceremony. Across from Ellison sat Boasberg, still in his robe, though the weight of it now looked different. less like authority, more like armor. 2 U.S. Marshals flanked the door, silent but very present. Ellison wasted no time. "Did you receive early versions of amicus briefs from Southern Justice Collective before they were publicly filed?" she asked, her voice flat and unaffected. Boasberg hesitated, his fingers tapping the armrest. "Once, twice. They were drafts. Nothing final," he said, eyes averted. "Not official submissions." Ellison leaned forward, locking eyes. "That's not an answer. That's a deflection. Either you saw them or you didn't." Boasberg's throat moved as he swallowed. "It wasn't like that," he mumbled. "They were context, policy angles, nothing that changed my rulings." But Ellison had heard that defense before, from judges, politicians, and bureaucrats, who thought their robes, their roles, their rituals made them immune to accountability. She opened a folder and slid a printed email across the table. "This is from your law clerk to Nadia Bellamy. We've reviewed your language, tightened the security clause. Judge thinks it'll play better in written opinion. Explain that." Boasberg said nothing, not because he didn't have a response, but because he understood the moment was no longer his to control. The illusion of impartiality had fractured, and everyone in the room knew it. Ellison closed the file and stood. "You edited arguments submitted by a third party who benefited from your rulings." "That's not context, Judge. That's conspiracy." Outside the room, Tom Homan paced the corridor with Elise Tran, both aware the dominoes had begun to fall. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about revealing. And with every passing hour, more questions were rising, not just about Boasberg, but about who else in the system had let silence buy them power. By the following morning, the scandal had grown teeth. What began as a confrontation between Tom Homan and Judge Boasberg was now a full-blown federal crisis with tentacles stretching beyond Savannah. A second whistleblower, this time from inside Southern Justice Collective, came forward with 6 months' worth of internal emails, detailing coordinated communications with Boasberg's chambers. The emails weren't vague, they contained exact timestamps, version-tracked attachments, and even strategy notes, like align language with prior Boasberg ruling, pre-clear via clerk. Suddenly, it wasn't just about influence, it was about orchestration. At the Department of Justice, Mariah Ellison's task force expanded overnight. More staff, more subpoenas, more scrutiny. The name Howard Ashcroft, long whispered as a power broker in progressive legal circles, now sat atop a working list of individuals under quiet investigation. Ellison ordered retroactive audits of court communications, pulling records from Boasberg's cases over the past 5 years, then authorized a parallel review of judicial rulings in other districts flagged in the emails. But the implications went further. Congressional aides began briefing senior lawmakers on what they were calling a pattern of pre-filing manipulation. Judges in Arizona and Southern California, both of whom had cited similar nonprofit briefs in recent immigration rulings, were now under internal review. What was once dismissed as conspiracy theorizing had become something far more dangerous, a verifiable blueprint for back-channel judicial influence. In Washington, the Senate Judiciary Committee began preparing for emergency oversight hearings. Though public statements remained cautious, behind closed doors, lawmakers were already discussing the unthinkable, systemic failure at the federal bench level. Meanwhile, outside the Savannah courthouse, crowds began to gather, not activists or ideologues, but average citizens, some holding handwritten signs that simply read, "We trusted the system." Others stood silently, absorbing the gravity of what was unraveling in front of them. Homan, flanked by Elise Tran, didn't bask in the attention. If anything, he looked heavier now, like the weight of what had been exposed came with a personal cost. He gave no interviews, but one line he whispered to Elise was picked up by a nearby mic. "They thought this was about immigration. It's not. It's about who gets to write the rules and who they're writing them for." Across the country, federal courts were suddenly no longer quiet sanctuaries of impartial justice. They were question marks, and every ruling, every sealed opinion, every brief filed for context was now under the microscope. As dusk settled over Savannah, Tom Homan stood alone at the massive glass windows lining the courthouse lobby, his reflection staring back beneath the fading amber light. Behind him, the press pack had thinned, the chatter dulled, but the storm hadn't passed. It had only paused. His attorney, Elise Tran, approached quietly, holding a folded sheet of paper just released by the DOJ. "Boasberg's been suspended, pending full investigation," she said, handing it over. Homan took it without a word, eyes scanning the sterile bureaucratic phrasing. Misconduct deemed credible, immediate reassignment, ongoing ethics review. He folded it once, tucked it inside his coat pocket, and said nothing for a long beat. "You think this is justice?" Elise asked, breaking the silence. Homan didn't look at her. "No," he said flatly. "This is just the beginning." Outside, floodlights from news vans cast long shadows on the courthouse steps. Inside, everything felt unnaturally still, like a battlefield after the smoke, but before the cost was counted. Homan had faced riots, congressional hearings, threats, slander, but this was different. This wasn't a public argument. It was a quiet betrayal from within the walls of a system he'd spent his life serving. He had always known the system wasn't perfect, but now he knew it had been compromised, not by error, but by design. "We always said the courtroom was the last place truth had a shot," he murmured. "But if the bench is already spoken for before the case even starts, what's left?" Elise didn't answer. She didn't need to. They both knew the damage wasn't done. It was just starting to surface. The system hadn't just failed, it had pretended to function while handing decisions to people in the back rooms. Homan exhaled slowly, the kind that comes not from exhaustion, but from clarity. He wasn't interested in fame or vengeance or the cameras waiting outside. He wanted one thing, a courtroom that still meant something. And now that he had seen the cracks for what they were, he couldn't walk away. Not yet. Not when the real fight, the one for the soul of justice itself, was finally in the open. By sunrise the next day, Savannah was no longer the epicenter. It was merely the matchstick. The real fire had moved to Washington, D.C., where the marble halls of the Capitol buzzed with quiet panic. Inside a secure room beneath the Senate Judiciary Committee, Chairman Lowell Strawn reviewed the affidavit again, his jaw locked, his aides silent. "This isn't just optics," he said, pushing the document across the table. "This is exposure. Dangerous exposure." The contents were now confirmed, the metadata validated, the signatures authenticated. What had started as a confrontation over a deportation freeze had unearthed something far deeper, a coordinated effort across multiple federal courts to shape legal outcomes through pre-submission collaboration with third-party advocacy groups. In a closed-door session, the committee voted to open a formal inquiry into the use and abuse of amicus briefs across the judiciary. Within hours, memos were dispatched to federal circuit courts. The DOJ quietly expanded its task force. Staffers began combing through years of Boasberg's rulings, and then moved on to 2 judges in Arizona and another in Southern California, all of whom had cited near-identical language from groups tied to Southern Justice Collective. Media outlets scrambled to catch up, but the story moved faster than they could script it. By noon, every major cable news channel had picked it up, and the term Briefgate was born. Hashtags surged, editorial boards scrambled to reframe narratives, social media platforms filled with screenshots from the affidavit, highlighted in red and underlined by users trying to make sense of what had just shattered. Analysts debated whether this was judicial activism gone rogue, or the natural result of courts becoming ideological battlegrounds, but for average Americans watching from living rooms, break rooms, and kitchen tables, the question was simpler. Can you trust the person wearing the robe? Tom Homan's line, "Don't make this personal, Judge," was now looping across television screens, captions added, hashtags rising. It wasn't just a soundbite. It was a wound voiced aloud. For years, Americans had suspected the system played favorites. Now they had something concrete. Not a theory, not a feeling, evidence. The reckoning had begun, not because someone broke the rules, but because someone proved the rules were being rewritten. And as that truth echoed across the nation, the justice system, once cloaked in reverence, was now under the kind of scrutiny it had long reserved for everyone else. In a dim, second-floor apartment above a shuttered dry cleaner in Asheville, North Carolina, Nolan Greer sat cross-legged on the floor, lit only by the bluish glow of a muted news broadcast replaying courtroom footage from Savannah. His name was now everywhere, scrolling across tickers, trending in hashtags whispered in legal circles that once didn't know he existed. Yet here, in the stillness he had chosen, there was no sense of triumph, only fatigue. The affidavit he submitted had detonated a scandal, shaken the judiciary, and forced a national reckoning. But Nolan hadn't set out to burn anything down. He had just wanted someone, anyone, to stop pretending that corruption, wrapped in civility, wasn't still corruption. On his laptop, a blank document glowed, the cursor blinking patiently. He didn't know if it would become a letter, a record, or something else entirely, but some part of him believed the truth wasn't finished speaking. Not yet. Even as the media made him a symbol, he still felt invisible. His story had become public, but his voice hadn't, and that mattered. Across the country, federal agents had already begun searching the offices of implicated judges while congressional aides sifted through emails, metadata logs, and amicus submissions with fresh eyes. In Savannah, the courthouse steps were still crowded, but the mood had shifted from outrage to reflection. People weren't shouting anymore. They were asking quieter, harder questions about trust, about fairness, about what justice really means when those meant to protect it are the ones rewriting it. Meanwhile, Tom Homan remained at the center of it all, not for power, not for spectacle, but because he'd looked a judge in the eye and refused to back down. His confrontation had started a fire, yes, but it was Nolan's quiet truth that kept it burning. The final lines of the affidavit had not been read aloud in court, but Nolan remembered them clearly. Justice is not a title or a robe. It's a decision made each day by those who still believe in its weight. He took a breath, laid his fingers on the keys, and began to type. Whatever came next, it would not be silent. The story reveals a powerful lesson about the importance of accountability and transparency in the pursuit of justice. It demonstrates how a system that operates with unchecked influence can quickly become corrupt, even when those within it wear the mantle of impartiality. Through the courage of Nolan Greer and Tom Homan, we learn that truth, no matter how uncomfortable, must be spoken, even when it shakes the foundations of authority. Nolan's quiet bravery in revealing the manipulation behind closed doors shows that justice is not just about following the law, but also about holding those in power accountable, ensuring that their decisions are truly impartial. The story also teaches us that the fight for fairness is often not loud or visible but takes shape in moments of personal sacrifice, with individuals willing to speak up against the system. Trust in the justice system isn't something that can be taken for granted. It must be earned and protected by those who believe in its true purpose. The lesson is clear: when those in power are no longer questioned, the system fails to serve its people. The responsibility to maintain integrity lies with us all, in each action and decision made.